in Cain's life, obviously, and God's now going to speak to him. And again, more questions. Where's your brother Abel? It's an interesting question. It takes us back to the questions of Genesis 3, right? Does God, the omnipotent deity, actually know where Cain is? Of course, we have the sense that, yeah, he knows. This is a rhetorical question, isn't it? Cain's response, by the way, is the first lie. Did you see this? He says, I don't know. And then he asks a very interesting question. Am I my brother's keeper? This is, of course, a famous line, right? Any number of influential thinkers have spoken on the importance. We think of Martin Luther King Jr., don't we? And in several of his famous speeches, this notion of being the brother's keeper. Notice, this is the first question to God in the Bible. And it is kind of like the serpent's question of Genesis 3. It's a setup question, a rhetorical question. Clearly, the message is, you are your brother's keeper. If Cain, however, we can ask it this way, is his brother's keeper, is God his creation's keeper? Of course, Mary Shelley will ask a very similar question in her novel Frankenstein, right? Notice verse 10. Question 2. What have you done? We think of parents often asking this to children, and children's responses, I don't know. You'll remember, of course, that this is the question that in some ways was asked, of course, directly to Cain's mom at Eve in chapter 3, verse 13. We think of Shakespeare's Hamlet again, don't we? After he stabs Polonius, not realizing what he's done, Gertrude will ask him, what have you done? And you'll remember Hamlet says, nay, I know not, is it the king? So much contained there in our study of that play, Hamlet. The word listen is a beautiful, beautiful bit of storytelling. Your brother's blood is crying out to you from the ground. Blood, by the way, we should point out for your notes, is very important in the Bible. You can't eat it, you can't drink it. We'll get to that when we hit Leviticus, the book Leviticus. Crying is a wonderful verb, isn't it? This seems to suggest that there's this notion of Abel's spirit. Already we may have this understanding of the dualistic nature of humans, that is to say the body and the spirit of the soul. We think of Plato's Phaedo in this regards. This may suggest the idea of justice as well, the idea of the crying of blood. The birth maybe of the theodicy question. Why does God allow terrible things to happen to good people? This idea of crying out to God is a significant. For example, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Of course, quoted by Christ on the cross itself. This is going to be a motif that we will see over and over again, this crying to God, crying to the Lord for help, for succor, for justice. Often Christ will be understood and read as an Abel-like figure, of course. Notice this crying from the ground, the very ground out of which Adam was formed, the ground which was cursed, of course, in Genesis 3. Amazing storytelling. Can we say this again? The poetry, the drama. We're forced to ask, what will happen next? Will God kill Cain? Will he punish the parents? I mean, what's going to be the dynamic here? Verse 11. Go back and take a look at it. You now are cursed. Now, the serpent was cursed in 3:14 of Genesis. The ground was cursed with Adam's situation in 3:17 of Genesis. This is the first human to be cursed. Notice, not his parents, but Cain, right? And notice this notion from the ground. Here, dirt is so important in the Bible. Dust thou art, to dust returnest. It takes us back to Genesis 3, of course, the story of a tree, doesn't it? Notice the ground which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Beautiful, compelling poetry, right? An amazing eye, we would say, poetic eye. An open mouth, drinking up the blood. Notice all the responsibility seems to fall on Cain here. This seems to suggest the notion of free will, doesn't it? Let's point out, Cain did not master sin. Now he has to pay the price. Retributive justice? Eye for an eye? Is that what we have here? Notice now verse 12. We'll go back up to verse 11 to get into the context here. And now you are cursed from the ground which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Let's take a look at some of these ideas here. At verse 12, when you till the ground, it will no longer yield to it your strength. He's no longer going to be a farmer. Later we're told he creates a city. Is this the birth of that notion of the urbane versus the rural kind of dialectic or tension that we sometimes will see in lots of works of literature? He says, you're going to be a fugitive, a wanderer on the earth. The Bible is full of these wanderers. We think of immediately Abraham, don't we? We think of Moses. We think of Jacob. We think of all kinds of wanderers, right? Cain, in other words, will have no home, it seems, right? It's like being driven out of Eden. It's like exile. And of course, in many ways, this is the heart of much of the story of the Old Testament, right? The wanderer is a powerful literary motif. You could jot down at 3a already all kinds of examples of this. We do have questions, don't we? Is this a worse curse than Cain's parents received? Is this a just punishment for murder? No, we have really no eye for an eye here. We will pay attention to the rules against murder in the Levitical Code as we come to it later. By the way, it's been pointed out by a number of scholars that in verse 13, you have Cain's famous 7 sins. Write this down. This is fascinating. You have the sin of impiety in verse 3, the sin of anger in verse 5, the sin of jealousy in verse 5, the sin of deception in verse 5, the sin of murder in verse 5. Of course, he lies about it, falsehood in verse 9. He's self-seeking or selfish in verse 13. All of these, of course, result in alienation from God, verse 14 and 16. It's a compelling story. Cain's response is to request justice, which obviously is a bit ironic. And he will say it, of course, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Let's go ahead and look now at these verses. Cain says in verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Verse 14, today you've driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a 7-fold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now let's take a look at some of these observations. Notice Cain's response is to request justice, which, as we've said already, is ironic. He says, my punishment is greater than I can bear. His question, is Cain really sorry, do you think? Or is he still only thinking about himself? And that is to say, is he selfish? Well, what did he expect God to do, do you think? By the way, the justice question of Plato's Republic, especially that opening question of Book 1, is significant here, isn't it? By the way, the Christian response, 1 Corinthians 10:13, is an interesting one, right? God will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. Obviously, a reflection back to this verse. Note how these early stories are setting up the major themes of the whole Bible, right? By verse 14, Cain says, you have driven me away from the soil, driven just like being driven out of Eden for his parents in Genesis 3. No, not driven from his family, but driven from the soil. There is no mention, notice here, of his family. The word's, in fact, not even used in Genesis 4. He says, I will be hidden from your face. Again, amazing poetics, a great eye. This is the, notice, last time maybe that Cain will ever speak with God. We think of Psalm 13, how long will you hide your face from me? We think of Isaiah 59:2 and Isaiah 64:7. This is an important motif in the Bible, right? This idea of the face of God being somehow distant from the one who calls out to God, or even to the people who call out to God. He says, I'll be a fugitive and a wanderer. Anyone who meets me may kill me. Notice Cain echoes God's words here. This is beautiful poetry, the overlay. Who else other than Adam and Eve is going to kill Cain? Right? I mean, at this point, all we have, according to the biblical text, is Adam and Eve, Cain's parents, right? Notice he says it. They're not going to murder me, but they'll kill me. And this is interesting phrasing of words, right? Obviously, we have some questions here as well. Do you have any compassion for Cain? Does he ever say he's sorry or repentant? Why is Cain not worried more about his brother and only himself? What about, for example, Abel's burial and the funeral service? And again, what's not mentioned is fascinating. Is Cain a symbol of a certain kind of person? Is Cain a symbol for the people of God, the Hebrews later? Again, this dance motif I was talking about earlier, this movement, this dialectic back and forth between God and his people. Notice verse 15. God seems to be ready to show some compassion to Cain. He says whoever kills Cain will suffer a 7-fold vengeance. We'll get to that one later in this chapter as well. Notice there's no mention here whatsoever of where other humans are going to come from who could maybe, for example, kill Cain. The word suffer, we will want to point that one out, right? First use of this word maybe in the text, and the key maybe to understanding human existence. The idea of sevenfold is the number of perfection. Vengeance makes us think of Romans 12:19, doesn't it? Vengeance belongs to God. Is this an act of love by God? And what about retributive justice? We're told that the Lord put a mark on Cain. A whole lot has been written on this. You can Google this for yourself. Of course, the mark of Cain in Beowulf's Grendel will mention in our Beowulf lecture, so you can do your own research here. Is this a sign? Is it an omen? Ezekiel 9:11 seems to be a possible corollary, a possible parallel. We can look at Genesis 9:25 in a story we're going to get to later, the curse of Ham, and tragically the way in which this passage and the curse of Ham in Genesis 9:25 has been a validation, believe it or not, for slavery. It's a sad misapplication of biblical text, and yet it has happened. No one who came upon him would kill him. Who is alive, obviously, other than mom and dad? A question, right? It seems to be that Cain will be apart from other humans, somehow in isolation. And what about Cain's parents? Verse 16, he went away from the presence of the Lord like his parents, and leaving Eden like exile. Exile is to be separated from the presence of God. I mentioned the word alienation earlier. We should point out here, as often has been made clear, sin is about separating humans from God. And he settled, we're told, in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Settled suggests that he now has a new home. Land of Nod, you can do your own research here. To nod off to sleep, that is to say, to forget. Nod is some kind of wandering, the word itself seems to suggest. We immediately think of Steinbeck's classic, The Great American Novelists, East of Eden. I would challenge you to read that novel just so you can appreciate all the different ways in which that novel is playing with the game of Genesis 4. Some more questions again. What about Cain's parents? You notice we keep asking this question. What about a burial for Abel or his funeral? Note all the stuff not mentioned in this story. I mean, I've just mentioned a few here. You can obviously come up with your own. We now turn to some verses that we're not going to read out. You can read them on your own. But verse 17, we're told Cain knew his wife. Some have always asked, is this his sister? We have a silent Bible on this issue. Enoch is Adam's grandson. Cain will build a city. It's the very first one that we're told about. And he names the city after his son, which begs a really interesting question. Why doesn't he name the city after himself? Why does he name it after his son? Is this evidence of some kind of shame? By the way, this is not the Enoch of Genesis 5:21-24 who does not die. That's a different Enoch. Verses 18 through 24, we're just going to pass over very quickly. This is an emphasis on civilization. It kind of sets us up for the way this chapter is going to end. We have several of these overviews of generations that we're going to see. But do point out that Lamech takes 2 wives. This seems to be the introduction of polygamy. It will be the norm for quite some time, and it does not seem to be condemned here, we should point out. Verse 20, by the way, Jabal, we're told, those who live in tents and raise livestock. Verse 21, Jubal, those who play the lyre and the pipe. Verse 22, Tubal-Cain is the maker of bronze and iron tools. And then the sister is also mentioned of Naamah. She, by the way, is the first woman mentioned as a sister. By the way, notice how many of these are artists of a kind. Again, this idea of civilization or culture to some degree, right? And then you have this very interesting verse 23. Let's go to it really quickly. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, "Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say." It's kind of poetics, right? As well, the way it's written. "I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, surely Lamech 77-fold. Now, this is an interesting kind of dynamic here. Avenged 7-fold is mentioned here. This begs the question, is it true that once we have the city, once we have lots of people kind of living close together, we have the first evidence of some notion of murder? Obviously, this is going to create the question about the need for law, right? We'll think about Deuteronomy 32:35, for example, here. Notice how violence ultimately will lead to the flood story that we're going to meet next, right? Lots of questions here, like, is God losing control already of this creation, of his world? We obviously have the need for some conflict resolution at play here. And then, of course, has anything changed today? There's a 3B question for you. Do you still find the case that most people resort to violence when there is this issue of conflict resolution, right? No, by the way, do point out that it was a young man who struck the old man Lamech, so maybe we have youth-old age game being played here as well. So many things to be read into these amazing passages. By the way, just as a point of reference, notice Matthew 18:21 through 22, and the passage about how many times should I forgive, Christ coming back to the story, alluding to the story. And now to finish, verse 25. Right? Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and named him Seth. For she said, quote, God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel because Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to invoke the name of the Lord. Now let's finish up here. Verse 25, Seth, God, notice interestingly, God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel. Notice this is the only comment by Eve, the only comment by the parents about in this entire story, right? Appointed. It's an interesting word. Does this seem to suggest that children are in fact a gift from God? Certainly can be a reading, no question. Verse 26, Seth's son Enosh is Adam's grandson, we should point out. And then this interesting phrase, at that time. We see this often in the biblical text, especially in the first 5 books of the Bible. At that time seems to suggest that there's a perspective from the author who's telling the story. What is that perspective? People begin to invoke the name of the Lord is interesting because you're going to have lots and lots of debate about what exactly that means. Notice this is not men, but people, the use of the word people, both males and females. And notice that this word invoke, to call on or to proclaim, this is going to be a common motif in the Bible. Now this idea about what this actually means, this name of the Lord, has given rise to an idea that I mentioned earlier but did not go into, nor will I here, the documentary hypothesis. There are people who argue that no, really this special name of God doesn't get used until the time of Moses in Exodus 6, 2 through 6. You can do your own research here as well. What a compelling story. Let's finish with a few observations in conclusion. Yes, this is a story about family. More particularly, it's really a story about brothers. Luke 15, 11 through 32 tells the story of what Christ's parable is often referred to as the prodigal son. There you have brothers as well. Begin to ask about this relationship of brothers throughout the text. There's, of course, a story as well about growth of people, civilization, cities, seems to lead to violence. Notice, one step from Eden, we have these 2 different killings in Genesis 4. And it's going to set up the story of Noah as we will meet it, where all of a sudden we're going to be told that violence becomes the norm, and in the process something has to be done. Ironically, by God, it will be violence. Come back, we'll have more conversation. Thank you.